And let me just start by saying, first of all, thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you also to the panelists. As you know, we have issued an evaluation on the IMF Advice on Fiscal Policy last month, and using the evaluation as reference, we wanted to have a discussion on the fund's advice on fiscal policy with a renowned set of experts. You all know them, they're very well known in this institution, in the IMF. Very briefly, I think it's a panel that combines both policy making and research expertise. Again, just introducing very briefly, of course, Laura Alfaro is the Chief Economist and Economic Counselor of the Inter-American Development Bank. In Spain, we always say Latin American, I don't know. Inter-American Bank. Professor at Harvard Business Schools and former Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica. Adam Posen is the Peterson Institute, President of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He has been a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee and the panel of economic advisors of the US Congressional Budget Office. Rodrigo Valdes is the Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department, former Director of the Western Hemisphere Department, and former Minister of Finance in Chile. They're all well known, widely published and cited authors. They have different awards and distinguished fellowships, so I really thank you all for being here. The fourth panelist is Hélène Poirson. She has led the evaluation. Unfortunately, we're having troubles in having her online. So we're just going to go directly to the debate. The first, of course, we're here today. We wanted to talk about our evaluation. So the first part of today's presentation was precisely about Hélène summarizing the main elements of the report, but I'm going to leave that option for a little bit later in case he's able to join in. And if you don't mind, Laura, Adam, and Rodrigo, let's go directly then to the debate. The idea is to have an open discussion about the issues, and whenever you feel that you want to intervene, just signal with your hands, and we'll go directly to that, and we will have an opportunity for Q&As at the end of the session. Okay, so if I may, I will just start with a general question to the three of you. Okay, so one of the things that the evaluation covers a very long period of time. It goes back to the global financial crisis, and one of the elements that is highlighted in the evaluation is how during this period the fund has significantly changed its fiscal playbook. So it was an IMF pre-global financial crisis that was very much focused on fiscal sustainability, and over this more than 15 years, it is a much more multidimensional approach, and there is higher weight assigned to the role of fiscal policy in output stabilization and in provision of longer-term priorities. Of course, there is a debate of how much this has been driven by the context of crisis and ineffectiveness of monetary policy during these years, or how much is more of a structural change on the fund's advice that is also guided by the members' priorities. So it's a general question to the three of you by any order. So what is your general view on how the fund's advice has evolved, and what is the balance among these three broad objectives of output stabilization, fiscal sustainability, and provision of longer-term public goods, the way that we frame it in the evaluation? What is the balance of those objectives in the current context? Could I start with Laura? Okay.
Man, it's actually good that I was an A, but sometimes. So first, thank you for the invitation, and congratulations to the evaluation. I was part of one. I do know it's a lot of work. I also congratulate the willingness of the IMF to engage in these evaluations. When I was at the ministry in Costa Rica, we had the mandate to do evaluations, and I realized it's very hard to self-evaluate because there's a lot of political constraints, and so I actually congratulate this effort. Also, I need to say that what I'm going to say represents my views and not the views of the IDB. So I congratulate the movement to more research and understand the effects of complex policy, and fiscal policy is a very complex policy. I think as a policymaker and as academic, I think we have benefited a lot from all the work that the IMF has done in this area, and I do think there has been a lot of improvements, but at the same time, as an academic, as a policymaker, I am aware that this is complicated. The multiplier that we have had from previous times may not necessarily be the multiplier we're going to get now. These estimates of multipliers are also get revised very often. In fact, this year there's a very nice paper by an Argentinian woman, Paola, from UC San Diego, that's evaluating some of these multipliers, and what she gets is that they're actually lower than we thought, so there's actually not a lot of crowding in, there's more crowding out. And I also come from the region that I come, so I'm also aware that there are political constraints, capacity constraints, and that money is fungible. And I say all of this because I was in government around the global financial crisis, and I remember when the IMF made a call to spend, and I remember thinking, oh my God, we don't need to be told to spend. That we can do. What we cannot do is not spending or saving in good times. And so I think in that sense, these trade-offs or output stabilization, sustainability, and long-term provisions of public goods, I think when the crisis comes, I think there's a lot of pressure to spend, but I think that one has to remember that at some point we have to not spend, and I think that becomes a little bit harder. And so because of these political constraints, I sometimes think that probably we should be a little bit tougher early on, because I do think the spending is going to happen. And it's hard to get that when you're selling many objectives. So I think some focus got lost there, but again, this is from the point of view of a region that likes to spend, or is easier to spend not to. Having said that, even Latin America, I think we have done a lot to improve, and so that is an appreciation. The other one is there has been a movement of thinking that government is the way to grow, and I think one has to keep in mind that in the long term, the way we grow is productivity, and it's not clear to me necessarily fiscal gives us more productivity. Again, this is tainted by the region that I come from, that we are having problems with low productivity growth. But again, I do think it's good to try to put a lot of nuance to these complex issues. I think we just need to remember that at the end, they're going to be implemented in very complex scenarios.
Thank you, Laura. Some initial remarks, Adam?
Well, first off, thank you for including me on this very distinguished panel as a non-Spanish speaker. And congratulations indeed to Pablo and everyone involved in the report. Hélène, I hope she'll at least hear the recording. She and the team did great work. There were a bunch of very good background papers, which we got to see. As a close observer and neighbor of the fund, but someone who is not directly on the line, as some people are, I'm going to take a big picture approach and be more positive, I guess. I think if we go back 15 years, it's mostly fiscal jokes had become a very bitter pill for the world. And the association of the fund with, in a lot of places in reality, but also in perception, with knee-jerk fiscal austerity was very harmful and included some bad things during the European crisis, and included the invocation of some academic work that was subsequently proven to be quite dubious. And so in the same spirit as what Laura was just saying, but even more so, I think the fund was including the fiscal department, including now the IEO, upper management, the country's desks, everyone involved was very wise to move in a credible way to a more nuanced and pragmatic approach to fiscal policy over the last several years. And I think it's boring to say, you know, it's good you went to something more of a interior solution than from what had been a somewhat extreme position, but it was the right thing to do, and it was the right thing to do economically as well as in terms of political legitimacy. I think it's very telling if you look at figure 2 in the new report, which, you know, nowadays with PDFs, who knows, I'm not going to give you a page number, but anyway, it's the chart of the rolling variance of government cyclically adjusted primary balance. And what it shows you is that the MEs have done much better in terms of limiting boom bust in that than they had in the past, and much better than the advanced economies in the current same period. And I think, though you all don't get enough credit, I think the fund, including the changes in the fiscal approach, played a very big role in that outcome. And I think it is quite striking that during COVID, there were a large number of emerging markets, but even lower income economies that went through that and then went through a major rapid Fed and other advanced economy central bank tightening cycle without terrible things happening. I'm not disagreeing with Laura on some of the fundamental issues that there's always a bias to spend and you need that. But I do think we have to look at the success that in relative terms, in terms of resilience and sustaining reasonable, oh good, this worked, and sustaining moderate, not necessarily ideal, but moderate fiscal policies, I think things have worked. And so finally linking it back to the three-pronged approach that Pablo was summarizing, I think it was important to have all three concepts of countercyclical, long-term sustainability, public goods provision together. All that said, I do think there are a couple fundamental problems which we can return to. The one I'll just close this bit with is we do have a situation now where the US in particular, but a number of advanced economies in general, are behaving in fiscal terms in very irresponsible ways. It is going to be difficult, if not impossible, for the fund or any other person to call out the US in this situation, or at least to call out the US in any specific way beyond the obvious. And so there is, in addition to the substantive issue of that, the question of how much can you make the intellectual case that virtue is its own reward? That even if the US or certain other countries that have size and geopolitical heft can get away with irresponsible policies, it's in your own best interest, the rest of you, not to do that. I think that case may become easier and already is easier now than it used to be. Again, having seen through this Fed tightening cycle in recent years, the ongoing access to capital markets of the vast majority of emerging markets in recent years for their public debt is, again, I think an underappreciated success and reinforces that message that even if the US or France or whoever is being hypocritical, it's still in your interest to not. So anyway, but I'm very pleased with the report.
Thank you, Adam. Rodrigo, all your opening views.
Okay, no, thank you for the invitation. Congrats to the IEO and Hélène specifically. Let me start by saying that the first recommendation of the report, which is basically that country assessments should include a view on fiscal policy, I think is very important. It's right on the mark. We cannot be silent, okay, on fiscal policy. I think that is well taken. I discussed this with someone in the department who reviews a lot of reports and tries to push this idea, not always successfully, but the view from fiscal affairs was, we need to have a view. Now, having said that, I think we need to have space for nuances, and it's very important not to be too mechanical on these evaluations. There are considerations that are more state-dependent, depends on, and I will go back to that in a sec, and also acknowledge our own uncertainty and lack of knowledge and lack of specific data that also has to be put into the equation. But on this issue about nuances about based on specific considerations of countries, let me add 4 things. One, I think it's very important when you put here the trade-off about stabilization, sustainability, and long-term provision of public goods, to think that really public goods require permanent financing. It's very important not to be tempted too much to finance with debt, things that are on recurrent spending at the end. That is a recipe for disaster. So the trade-off there is less obvious, has to do with taxes, with other things. Second point, risking sustainability probably opens very small fiscal space in the short run. You need to be very careful thinking that there is a trade-off sometimes when you don't have financing. To some extent becomes an illusion, the trade-off, when you are cornered. So again, that trade-off exists many, many times, but we have to be very careful to be clear when it doesn't exist. Third point, on output stabilization, I think this is very important. I grew up in a generation that was moving from being super fiscally active to zero fiscally active, okay? And the global crisis really put back fiscal on the table. And I think here it's important to recognize first that it matters a lot, your macro policy framework. If you have an inflation targeting regime with a proper central bank, floater, and also you have, for some reason, a fiscal rule, it's of tall order to abandon the fiscal rule, go all in. There's a coordination issue between the fiscal and monetary policy. So that's one case. A very different case is that you have a fixed exchange rate, a rather close financial account. Anyway, in that case, fiscal has a very different role to play. So we have to be careful in this coordination of policies when we talk about fiscal. One specific thing there is the zero lower bound. The zero lower bound opens a space for fiscal that is very different from when you are not there. So that's, I would say, a state contingent consideration that is super important. And the final point, and this goes back to something that Laura had a view, and I think has a slightly different one, but I think we agree at the end of the day. This is a dynamic problem. It's not a period-by-period optimization. And really, really, this problem is defined in good times. If in good times you don't behave, you don't have spaces, trade-off to talk about in bad times. And this is very important for what you were mentioning in terms of the developed world, I think, and also some emerging markets, that we're now in good times, cyclically, and we see very little adjustment at the end of the day. And that's a problem because in the next one, we won't have the possibility of discussing trade-off because it will be an illusion at the end.
Yep. Thank you. Hélène, I see you on the screen. Can you hear us well? Or?
Yes, I can hear all of you very well.
Sorry,
yes.
Yeah, there were some technical problems, and also welcome to the people that are attending online. We started with some initial remarks. I'm not sure how much have you been able to hear, but please, Hélène, go ahead with your initial remarks that I guess are related also to the main findings of the evaluation, and we can continue with the discussion.
Very good. So I will, we did not hear the initial remarks, Pablo, for those who attended virtually, but I'll go through them if you'd like. So good afternoon, everyone. I was here 15 minutes ago, and I'm here now to walk you through the IMF Independent Evaluation Office's 2025 evaluation report on IMF Advice on Fiscal Policy, which reviews the period from 2008 through 2023. This was an extraordinary era. It was marked by the global financial crisis, followed by a prolonged period of historically low interest rates, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then finally the return of inflation. The IMF's approach to fiscal advice during this period underwent a fundamental transformation, which I just heard was touched on by the previous speakers. Today, I'll summarize this core shift, what worked during that process, the challenges that emerged, and the 4 key recommendations of the report for the future. So starting with this fundamental shift in the IMF fiscal advice, the report's central finding is that the IMF successfully evolved from a pre-crisis narrow focus on fiscal sustainability to a broader, more active, and multidimensional approach. Before 2008, fiscal advice was largely focused on maintaining debt sustainability. After the crisis hit, the fund became a leading global advocate for fiscal activism. This new approach balanced 3 core objectives. First one was output stabilization, so actively using fiscal policy to smooth economic cycles, especially where monetary policy was constrained at the effective lower bound. The second objective was maintaining fiscal sustainability, but with a more nuanced understanding of risks of liquidity and rollover risks. And the third one was supporting longer-term economic sustainability, as was just mentioned, by emphasizing fiscal policy role in supporting and fostering potential growth, public investment, and providing critical public goods, including climate resilience and social protection. This important shift was driven by necessity, so the IMF adapting to the demands of member countries for advice in those areas, but also by new economic research, both internally and externally, and by decisive internal leadership. The evaluation credits the fund for 3 important strengths and adaptations during this period. The first one is its responsiveness to crises. The fund made early and vocal calls for global stimulus during the global financial crisis and COVID-19. Those calls were seen as timely and influential. The fund provided clear, actionable guidance, famously advising member countries to spend as much as you can, but keep the receipts. The fund also displayed intellectual leadership. Its research challenged the prevailing orthodoxy, particularly showing clearly the significant output costs of fiscal consolidations and helping to debunk the pre-GFC prevailing view that austerity could be expansionary. And finally, a third strength was the development of tools. The fund developed and refined a critical analytical frameworks to support its new approach, such as the fiscal space framework to better tailor its advice, and it modernized debt sustainability analysis to better incorporate liquidity, market access risks, and vulnerabilities from debt composition and from contingent liabilities. However, this rapid evolution also, together with the expanded fiscal surveillance mandate, introduced significant complexity, which in turn led to 4 ongoing challenges. And I'll go through each one of those in turn. The first challenge was what one could call the clarity gap. The bilateral country reports frequently lack specific actionable advice on the fiscal stance. And this is a finding that came to us as a surprise. But the recommended magnitude of the adjustment or stimulus, and in some cases even the direction of adjustment or stimulus, was unclear, especially in the case of emerging market economies and low-income countries. A second challenge was the uneven analysis and coverage. The depth of analysis on core issues like policy mix, spillovers, longer-term trade-offs varied widely across countries, sometimes very well covered, other times missing or lacking in depth. This was driven, we were told, by data gaps but also different team resources across countries, and the challenge of prioritizing amidst an ever-broadening surveillance agenda. And that's something that we heard over and over from different mission chiefs interviewed. Flavor of the day. We have to cover everything in a set amount of pages. Challenge number three, was the underutilization of tools. So this toolkit that the fund developed was not consistently applied. Tools such as fiscal multiplier, realism checks, or the assessments of automatic stabilizers and the fund's research in that area were not used consistently. This sometimes led to over-optimistic projections. And debt sustainability analysis, while they were always featured in bilateral country reports, were not always integrated with the baseline fiscal advice. The final and fourth challenge that the evaluation uncovers is the perception of uneven-handed treatment. These inconsistencies in what was covered, how deeply it was covered, and how well it was justified led to perceptions that the fund's advice was not always even-handed across the membership. So to address these challenges and to strengthen the quality and the traction of the IMF advice, the IEO proposes 4 actionable recommendations. The first recommendation is to sharpen the advice on output stabilization, to ensure that staff reports provide clear, specific guidance on the fiscal stance, as well as its macroeconomic impact and interactions with monetary, financial, and exchange rate policies. Staff reports should also articulate clearly the trade-offs between sustainability and stabilization and explain not just the what, so which measures, but why, the rationale for the chosen measures, as well as the rationale for the proposed and the recommended medium-term anchors. The second recommendation is to enhance both the use and the depth of the analytical toolkit. So building on the earlier progress made by the fund during this period, promote more consistent use of existing tools and invest in further research to fill in some critical gaps in the toolkit. And the report identifies 4 areas: the debt data, integrating liquidity risk, particularly for low-income countries where there was less advanced progress, refining the fund's approach to setting medium-term anchors and anchoring them not in the country context, also take into account long-term spending needs when setting those anchors, and finally, better understanding the distributional impacts of the proposed fiscal measures. Because what we heard over and over again from both mission chiefs and country officials is that there's not necessarily a disagreement with the fund recommendations, but the political will or the social acceptability of the measures was a key area from preventing implementation. Third recommendation is to proactively address fiscal sustainability in a context where debt levels have built up. This involves strengthening advice on the fiscal risks, as well as debt management, and advice on the design of fiscal rules and frameworks, and linking DSA findings more directly to policy recommendations. Final and fourth recommendation is to clarify the long-term trade-offs and enhance the realism of IMF advice in this area. On trade-offs, this would involve better articulating how spending on long-term priorities like climate, sustainable development goals, or social protection affects growth, debt dynamics, and distribution, and where financing is constrained, the evaluation stresses that the fund needs to go beyond listing the spending needs, but also help countries identify the financing gap, ideally quantify it where feasible, and options to create fiscal space. In conclusion, the report finds that the IMF has achieved a successful transformation of its fiscal advice to meet the demands of a crisis-prone world. The task now for the fund is to deliver that sophisticated advice that balances these objectives with greater consistency, clarity, and country-specific relevance. And as we face a new macroeconomic chapter of higher debt, higher interest rates, higher inflation, implementing these recommendations is crucial to ensure that the fund remains a trusted, effective, even-handed advisor on fiscal policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hélène. So continuing with the discussion. I think you raised a number of issues that are interesting. You seem to all agree that this is largely state contingent. This is a situation of zero lower bound. You were raising issues such as countercyclicality has worked better in advanced economies. I think that's an interesting finding of the evaluation. It has worked better in advanced economies, but not so much. And the advice of the fund has been countercyclical in advanced economies. It did take into account economic slack, but not so much in emerging and low-income countries, where the recommendations still were still to tighten. You've also talked about, don't ask me to spend too much now, and I need to adjust later. And indeed, that's also another interesting finding. There are some concerns that the emphasis on spending in crisis is not much enough with the gradualism of the gradual adjustment in good times. So that creates sort of a ratchet effect and an increase in debt. So I guess my question to you, or my questions to you is, I guess, being state contingent, what is the current recommendation in the current situation? Because there are there's tighter financial conditions, but we are still subject to large shocks and large uncertainty. And second, what kind of mechanisms should the IMF promote? I mean, I think the evaluation we're talking about maybe some automaticity, increasing automatic stabilizers. Right. What can we do there? And in the case of the increase in debt, what can the fund do more on debt anchors? And that's another recommendation that we have. It's interesting. I would like to emphasize that, yes, that first recommendation struck me, and you signaled it out, Rodrigo, which is, I was surprised that the fiscal stance was not clear in many of the Article 4 reports. I just couldn't believe it. But those general questions, what in terms of instruments to ensure more prudence and tighten governments, and how you see the stance. Maybe we can go in a different order. Laura, I will not ask, actually on debt anchors, you have a very interesting paper on a simple GDP debt anchor that you're saying that it can be optimal in practical terms. But we can start with you again, or maybe give the floor to Rodrigo this time around. Okay.
No, it's okay. Let me continue to be the fiscal hawk here. I'm going to say something a little bit critical. I don't think we can necessarily say it's a success if you only got countries to spend in bad times, but you did not get them to reduce debt in good times. And so I would take an issue there. I think it was very easy to get countries to spend global financial crisis and to get them to spend in COVID. Mm-hmm. But we have not been able to do the opposite. So I wouldn't call that a success. You can tell the kid, go to the party. The success is the kid comes back to the party, and the kid hasn't come back from the party. And in fact, you do see an inflection after the global financial crisis in terms of debt. That is clearly the inflection. It was not COVID. It was a global, because you told countries spend. And then I also think we need to be careful, because we had a bad shock, we need to spend. We have another bad shock, we need to spend. So it was the global financial crisis and the climate crisis and the COVID crisis and then the war. And then I'm like, if you have a shock every year, then they're not transitory, you're permanently having shocks. And so it goes back to what Rodrigo said, in the world of permanent, it's not that. You have to make it sustainable, and that is a different game. And so I would take a little bit of an issue before calling it success, because it hasn't ended. So, and the reality is that right now everyone's spending like mad, and the world was growing. And so I think that this movie, we still need to wait to see the ending. And thus, this view that I have that sometimes just simpler is better. Just to say, like, this is what you need to do, and stay a little bit there. But it's not because I necessarily believe that's the optimal. It's because it's taking into consideration all these realities that we know.
Rodrigo.
Look, let me start from a reality. I think that fiscal policy is super political at the end. So it's very important to recognize that we are not discussing this with an independent central bank, where only a few very technical considerations will be taken on board. No? So given that part, I think we need to be very careful in how we craft the fiscal discussion. And in terms of debt rules, et cetera, let me first acknowledge something that in the Fiscal Affairs Department have been working for a while, which is the role of trust in the different players in the political arena to have a good outcome on fiscal. When society there is mistrust, it's very difficult to agree on who pays when, etc. The problem is that we don't have a lot of instruments to build trust, or perhaps it's not an economist sort of part, it's politicians, sociologists, someone else has to study that. But there are a few institutional developments that we do that help trust. And a fiscal rule is one, given that you asked about fiscal rules. But fiscal councils, transparency, ideas that you can have around this. How do you ensure that you are competent as a government? No? So there's a lot of micro aspects also beyond macro that matter for the discussion. And in that, fiscal rules, I think, play a very important role. Okay? And fiscal rules have been useful in many, many places. And I'm with Laura here. Has to be simple, has to be easy to monitor, has to be, and at the end of the day, debt ratios are something very important. Okay, and the second point I want to make on this, I want to add a bit of a fiscal hawk view in the following sense. In the discussion, we have a lot sustainability as an aspect, but that's one level of debt, okay? And let's imagine that we agree. This level is sustainable. But that doesn't answer a more difficult question, that is, what is optimal debt for a country? And if I take into account the effects of debt just in the rest of society, making the cost of capital higher, or the impact it has in monetary policy, how much more difficult is monetary policy when you have too much debt, or the temptation to put restrictions, do some fiscal type financial repression in a country. And there are more and more things, no? The problems of independence of the central bank when you are really, really with high debt. You come to the idea that, yeah, we need lower debt at the end of the day. Sustainability is not enough. It's super important, but it's a bit too high as a criteria to determine what is debt. What should be debt.
So I guess I'm the partial dove on this panel. You know, the old joke is you're an owl, neither a hawk nor a dove, and I'm a gray-bearded owl. I think where Rodrigo ended up is where I'm going to end up. But I think we're overlooking two things here. First is, notwithstanding what both of you said, the literature, the econometric evidence on the effectiveness of fiscal rules is pretty weak. So I understand, just as with inflation targeting, you have a target because it forces transparency, it forces accountability. You have a fiscal rule, and as you said, it's simpler the better. But don't oversell it. The fiscal rules get shed when there are shocks, when there are political issues. It's not a deus ex machina. It's just a communications means, or at best a coordination mechanism. Second, going to the more sophisticated debt sustainability analysis, I take Laura's point and Rodrigo's point that sustainable isn't the same as optimal, and in particular, one should be suspicious of pushing back against, there's a shock every year and they're all in the same direction. But at the same time, what I do think the new generations of DSA work done here at the fund and a little bit elsewhere, including at the Peterson Institute, does emphasize is you can't you do lose something if you just focus on debt levels. Okay, growth is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Fiscal policy alone certainly does not lead to growth in any consistent way. Fiscal expansion certainly does not. But I think it's too much to ignore the fact that, empirically speaking, EMs and a lot of lower income economies did have less damage from a Fed tightening cycle, less damage in terms of labor market scarring, less damage in terms of financial crises, less damage in terms of instability over the last 15 years. And it is in part, and again, I give credit to some of the people in this building, that you've had a more holistic view. 1 second. I'm allowed to speak. But the place I come out where I sound like Rodrigo is, and this goes to something Hélène was saying, one complaint I had with the report is I don't feel you go far enough on the automatic stabilizers front. That is something where there is good research indicating that they are very useful. That is, instead of a rule, that's a mechanism. That is in the spirit of what Laura was just saying about you've got permanent expenditures, you should make sure that they're funded in a permanent way. So I wish both this report and the fund going forward would make a bigger part of its advice reducing discretionary fiscal policy and structurally increasing automatic stabilizers. Now you can say what
I see there were 200 by Rodrigo.
No, but I saw Rodrigo first.
Rodrigo first, yeah.
I want to recognize something that's very important. Rules by itself, they don't buy a lot.
Right.
But there is evidence, though, that rules that you maintain, that you comply with, really buy a lot in terms of sovereign risk, in terms of what.
But
at the end, monetary policy.
But that's circular, right?
Not fully, because it's like an inflation targeting, as you mentioned.
Right.
I think it's a very important thing that if you try to comply, if you explain why is the deviation,
right.
It's a tool
that's
precisely to agree on this. The second thing I wanted to mention, because you mentioned debt sustainability and debt ratios for rules, maybe with this way. Is debt to GDP something that is critical or not? And I think it's very important to differentiate the use of that ratio to organize fiscal policy, and I'm with Laura here, that is simple, is useful, is a good anchor to come back, doesn't need to be fixed, that would be a very bad rule. But I am completely with Adam in terms that debt sustainability analysis cannot be based only in debt to GDP ratios. And that's basically what the fund decided to do, and all these MAC, DSF, et cetera, you have like 7 letters, acronyms now, is very rich in terms of the distribution, in terms of fiscal feedbacks. So I think it's very important to differentiate the role of the simple ratio for debt sustainability analysis, which is one thing that I agree is far from being a sufficient statistics, from a very useful thing that is, look, we need to anchor our day-to-day discussion on something. And there, I think debt to GDP ratios continue to be super important.
Laura.
I am of the view that the reason why we did better in this crisis is not necessarily because we had a holistic approach, it's because we did a lot of homework following our real mess up with a lot of crises before. So I think the homework that was done to realize that poor people pay for inflation and poor people pay for debt crisis was the reason why later we did not overdo it. Now, if you want to call that a holistic approach, it could be, but I think it was the outcome of the lessons learned that excesses don't bring us benefits. And I think a lot of the countries just restrain from the excesses of the past. But I think that's an appreciation. My husband was at the Brazilian Central Bank, the first one that increased interest rates in Latin America, in the world. The Brazilians, the Chileans, because they know the party just leads to more poverty and income inequality. Is that being holistic, or is that having learned that these tools are not a miracle, like they do have? I don't know. I think that's an appreciation.
I think actually some of that is empirically distinguishable. And I think the research would suggest it isn't just a mapping of who had a bad time last time, learned better this time. I think if you go to the literature, that's not what you're going to find.
As I said, if you may want to call it holistic,
No,
I'm
doing more than calling
No.
holistic. I'm saying it's identifiably different than your hypothesis.
I do know some of the people in charge, and
I don't care about that. What I care about is the actual empirical outcomes. That's what matters for the poor people you're talking about. It's not the stories that the people who were in charge tell.
And I'm telling you, they chose not to be fiscally expansionary or not to do excesses on monetary policy.
Okay, let's try to, Hélène, I don't know if you have any reactions or.
I think as I was listening to Laura, you know, it's always hard to make a call on was it a successful transformation or not. I mean, we stand, the team that produced this report stands behind its view that it was successful in that if you think about the counterfactual and the IMF not changing, remaining with its pre-GFC narrow focus on maintaining sustainable debt and sort of largely only that, when the world has changed, right? If the world changes and the organization doesn't change, then that I argue is not a success. But so we maintain the view that it's successful, but it's also, I wanted to highlight another disconnect that the evaluation found, which is that while the institution transformed its approach, when we actually deploy these large language models in one of the background studies, to extract the advice at the country level, what we find in the medium term is that it is still predominantly consolidation advice. So things have not changed as much at the country level. We do see change. There's more emphasis on counter-cyclical policy goals in the emerging market economy space, not just in the advanced economy space, and that's very visible. But when you look at, so in the short term, and when you look at the medium term, it is still over 95% of the advice is about consolidation. Right. So the message of the report is, given this consolidation advice, contrasted with the increasing long-term spending priorities, then the reports have to articulate transparently how they reconcile the two, right? When you go to a member country and say, you need to meet your social protection needs, your climate adaptation, et cetera, and at the same time, the advice is consolidation, there is a link missing. So that's the central message.
One final double-handed, Rodrigo.
I have to say that I don't agree too much with you, Hélène, because again, those needs need to be funded with real money, not with debt. So I think it's super important to differentiate the cyclical and sustainability discussion and optimal debt levels from a very different discussion, I think, which is how we will fund many, many needs that we have. I think that produces a tension at the end of the day that worries me a lot if we go saying solve poverty through debt. Of course, there is the space of investment, which is murkier, one-offs, etc. But let me put it radically in a transfer program that would be forever in a country that cannot be with debt. That has to be funded from true money. One last thing, because I don't know if we will have more rounds. No?
Yeah, let me just at least one more round at taking advantage of this. Yeah,
okay. So let me just say one thing that the IEO cannot do everything, no? But I want to say also that the report looks at advice in a very specific, with a very specific lens that is country reports. 70%, 70, of the budget of Western Hem,
of fiscal
affairs.
Oops. And 90% of that.
No, 70% is CD. is technical assistance at the end. So a lot of the public finance, more broadly, advice that we do from the department is really, really very specific things that we go to a country. I don't want to say that it's better or worse than country reports or more pro-cyclical, counter-cyclical, but there's a lot happening there that I think is very demanded by country. We need to understand better the effects, etc. But there is a lot also happening in that space that is very important.
So, moving precisely to the issue of development, and you're saying you cannot, it has to be real money, you cannot get that. So the problem the evaluation finds here is that the advice that the fund is giving in long-term issues to developing countries is really basically aspirational in a lot of instances. No? So there is a demand. You have to talk about development, you mention them, but then the staff convey, there's really not possibility to finance it. But then this is creating also externally an expectation gap, because CSOs are telling you the IMF is not walking the talk. No? So they're talking about development, but the reality is they're not allowing for it. So what is it that the fund can do to help countries? What is the role of the fund in financing for development? Is it just leave it to the central banks, or to the development banks? I mean, or is it,
yes.
or does the fund have a role? I mean, we were arguing that there is a role in revenue mobilization. There might be a role in explaining the financial envelope. By the way, this also affects longer-term objectives of advanced economies and emerging economies as well, because there is now an increasing pressure on spending on climate, defense. Or aging populations. So what can the fund, and there are some what can the fund do to this, to try to coordinate it through its multilateral advice, or try to make some sense in these spending pressures that advanced economies are also having. So it's two problems, both for low-income countries, but for large and emerging countries and advanced economies, the huge spending pressures that they're facing. You were saying yes, Laura? Yes,
no, but now we should, you probably had more discussion in this panel than it seems that you had internally. Now let's start with the other side first.
No, I agree with Laura on this. I don't think it's the fund's job.
Okay.
And I wish the fund wouldn't. I understand all the pressures and the circumstances, but I wish you wouldn't. And in terms of the advanced economies, again, it's not like Rodrigo's department doesn't already do a lot of that. I think doing research in general cross-national statements about the erosion of balances is very important. And the other thing I was just going to say, the other key word that I felt was in the report but not emphasized enough, which Rodrigo did raise, and I know Laura cares about, is financial repression. And I think that maybe Hélène and the team, it was a backwards-looking report inherently, and it emphasizes processes and country reports inherently. But the big challenge, particularly in this geopolitical context we're in now, and the deficits and debt, particularly the US and Japan and countries like that are running up, is going to be financial repression. And I think that's what I would ask you all. It's very difficult, but I would ask you all to focus on that. And there's plenty of other people who can worry about developing, starting with the multilateral development banks, who can worry about funding for development. Focus on that.
Hélène, I think I saw a 200 on you. Hélène?
Yep. I think on this question of whether the IMF should replace the World Bank, so the answer is clearly no, as the other panelist has said. But that said, within that space of macro criticality and financing, the IMF does have value added in assessing whether these long-term plans for climate, et cetera, are macro financially feasible. And so what Rodrigo said, ultimately that's the IMF's job, is make sure it's feasible. So what the report emphasizes is that the IMF could go a little beyond debt sustainability and also use the tools that it itself has developed, including the SDG financing tool, the SDG Fit, to quantify the financing gaps and also look at the impact of filling those gaps on debt sustainability and growth. So look at the feedback loops. If the countries manage to find the funding for these priorities and spend on them, what does it mean for revenue? What does it mean for growth? What does it mean for debt sustainability? So take the analysis a step further and not just stop at, okay, there's no financing. And then on that aspect of securing the financing, the fund, as advice, tends to default to domestic revenue mobilization, which is, of course, key to broaden the tax base, but there could be more emphasis on reprioritizing within a given budget envelope, especially given the constrained financing environment. So to be more creative and look more at the strategic financing aspects is one of the messages of the report. So go beyond what the fund is already doing and doing well.
Rodrigo, I noticed in your first foreword of the fiscal monitor that you wrote, you're emphasizing a very straightforward answer. Fiscal policy is a structural policy. So
let me go into the. I mean, we have to be very careful with mission creep, and each institution has to do what it has to do. But I want to open the space for the advice that the fund can do for basically domestic resource mobilization, that we can do more about that. If you look, there are several cases that are very successful and others not. We have to learn more of what happened in those countries who were able to mobilize, that increased 4 or 5 percentage points of GDP, their tax ratios from very low levels to above 15, that is becoming our sort of bare minimum. No? So I think there is space there, especially when advanced countries are cutting direct support. And here we have a mantra at the fund to convince everybody that if you cut at the same time direct support and CD funding, this country will be in real trouble. So we really need to step up this arm of DRM. Second point, for rich countries, and I think Hélène said this, there is no much space to invent things. They have to go through the painful discussion of entitlements, the social contract, what is financeable for them. Taxes are already pretty high, and that I think is unavoidable. Will be the earlier you do, the less painful will be, and I think we cannot deviate too much from that.
Okay, I think we started late because of the technical problems, but I want to give, so I want to finish on time. So let's try to see if there are some questions from the audience. Just raise your hands, and there will be, the microphone is there for you to try to intervene. Let me maybe ask for, as people raise their hands, there's one issue that we've been mentioning, which is political economy concerns. It's interesting that authorities think that the fund is giving advice that a lot of times is not actionable. It doesn't take into account political economic considerations. But mission chiefs say, yes, they are taking into account political economic considerations. Not only that, they should not compromise what is first best advice. So I'm not sure how do you see that, how should they be incorporated, how can the fund improve its advice on political economy. I'm saying that because our next evaluation is precisely on political economy, so this might be useful. We're hitting at some issues on the evaluation. We're proposing more emphasis on distributional impact of policies, menu of options by the staff, clear rationale of the recommendations. But I don't know what your views are. Where should the fund stand? Should the fund be this first best ruthless truth teller, or does it have to better incorporate political economy concerns? You don't want to get into that.
Should I start? No, I have to.
Please.
No, look, I think one issue that we need to recognize is that feasibility is also dynamic. It's like fiscal policy. The red lines in one moment are not the same one in another moment. Authorities have instruments to build the consensus. We can help on that. So I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that these are restrictions that are not movable. They are there. We have to recognize them, but we can move them. Second thing, I would say that for advice versus programs, we have to distinguish because in programs we cannot set countries for failure in a program. So we need to be sure that whatever we do is actionable. Again, that's endogenous to the problems there are, how much we convince, but I would try to separate the two words. And finally, I think we need to recognize that for one problem, there are more than one instrument. And the instruments sometimes are better in certain dimensions and more inefficient in others. And be explicit on that. You can do this. However, it will be more costly in terms of growth, in terms of distribution, or something else. So I think we need to open the space, but to be very honest about what's the benefit of the first best advice.
So coming from a region that is very polarized in a world that is becoming more polarized, I think there might be some advantage of being a little bit more neutral than perhaps the instinct would be, just because I do see countries changing very quickly from one extreme to the other. And I think one may delegitimize these institutions if you're playing too much the extreme of the moment. And so thus the advantage of having someone just give a little bit more of a objective neutral. Now, being on the other side, I know that is not possible. There is the realpolitik. But I do fear that in this very polarized, if you're playing the guy of the moment, in 2 weeks is going to be a very opposite guy, and your policies would get delegitimized.
I don't know if there are questions. Anthony, do we have from the online audience as well? No. Yes, please.
Thank you. So I'm in the IEO, so maybe I shouldn't ask. But this is just on the backdrop of the discussion we just had that was very interesting. The evaluation, I think, is very comprehensive, and it focuses on a lot of right things. But, it just occurs to me that the real question, the elephant in the room is that fiscal policy main tasks are, redistribution and output stabilization, but let's call them shocks that we've seen in the last 5-6 years are unmanageable through fiscal means. And, fiscal policy, we can discuss ad nauseum, how you can correct debts in good time. There are no good times. This is a period of, it's very different from, say, the post-World War II world where, the United States budget went from around $49 billion in 1940 dollars to $258 billion in $45. And then there was an economic boom that just, ate away a lot of that debt. Now we're in a situation where advanced economies are not growing. Apart of course, from the United States, there's been a long stretch, and fiscal policy has dramatically failed at redistribution. And so, should the fund go and say, you should have to be more austere, think about saving, when it's good times? I think, the focus has to shift dramatically to maybe what Rodrigo was saying. There's a structural policies to remove the constraints of growth that come from a lot of wrong policies. We saw during COVID, and the IEO did an evaluation of the response of the fund to the COVID pandemic. There were, lockdowns that basically shut down the global economy, shut down the engines for a couple of years. There is nothing that fiscal policy can do to fix the debt that is generated by that kind of policy. So, we are really in a different level of the game. And so the question, it's not for Hélène, but maybe for the panel, do you guys see a need to rejig, the narrative completely, or you think it's, it seemed to me that from the discussion it was, we just need to do better what we haven't done enough before. My view is probably we need to do something completely different at the fund and outside the fund, but, just throwing it there to be provocative.
Maybe a second question here, and then we can, sorry? No. 2 and 3, and then, yeah.
Thank you very much. And again, huge kudos to IEO. This was very helpful for staff to read the report. We are currently evaluating ourselves, as you know, on the comprehensive surveillance review. I have a question to panelists. We know what Rodrigo thinks, but no, sorry, Rodrigo. Question to you. You know, we are thinking about surveillance in the next 5 to 10 years, right? And if you have any advice on the forward-looking, what should be the key focus on fiscal policy in the current landscape, that will be extremely helpful. Thanks so much.
And one final question.
Yes, on low-income countries. I mean, it seems that the IMF advice to low-income countries, no matter what the state of the world is going to be to consolidate. Short-term, long-term, consolidate. So my question to you is, what will be your recommendation for the, let's say, in a period of 5 years or so, for the staff of the IMF, the IDB, that are going to go to these countries and are going to say, well, you have to consolidate. Having in mind also that the multilaterals represent the bigger financing of these countries. So basically, we are asking them also, I mean, they are special in that sense. We are really the ones that are financing at least half, for a great majority of those, at least half of their external debt. So what will be your recommendation?
So maybe on reverse order, Rodrigo, Adam, Laura, if you want to have final reflections, answers. Okay. Adam. Yeah.
No, Adam, you start.
Since my views have the least impact, I'll start. On the first point about the growth and shedding everything and taking a new approach, I actually go back to some things Laura and Rodrigo said. I think the fund's job is to say, as honestly and as straight economically, not political economy as possible, these are the trade-offs and this is the reality. And I think what Rodrigo said about resource mobilization certainly applies to the US, to my country, that we have a tax to GDP ratio that is still very low, and calling that out is, I think, useful. It may or may not be effective in the short term, but I think it's the right thing to do. On this question, which leads directly into the very practical question of surveillance going forward, again, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but if there's one message I want to get across, the two things I'm most worried about, and here maybe the distance between Laura and I is not as great as it may have seemed. I do want to reduce fiscal discretion. I do want to reduce the ability to raise funding in a crisis and have it go on unchecked. And so I think putting into the surveillance process something about what things are discretionary more than it's been, what things are discretionary, what things are automatic, what things are indexed. Obviously the indexed part you've always done, but the sort of automatic versus discretionary I don't think has gotten as much attention as it should. And the second thing is, it doesn't fit in a neat box, but if you all don't start warning about financial repression in an ongoing, starting a way that's objective, at least attempts to be objective across countries, you're going to miss, I think, the biggest story. And obviously there are other people out there like Carmen Reinhardt and others who are raising this issue, but I would appeal to you to put that in to your forward-going surveillance, your forward-going research plans, your forward-going. That's where the action, frankly, is going to be, in my view.
There is this view that the spending that we're doing is great spending, and it's not. Like, we do know that a lot of the spending that we do is very regressive. And we do know that a lot of the tax policies we have are also very regressive. So I think having someone come and tell that to countries is not per se just consolidation, it's you can spend better. Like there's things you shouldn't be doing because it's not helping your poor people, it's not improving productivity, it's just going to some friends of the friends. and having an external party that comes, I know perhaps doesn't make you very popular, but I do think is useful. I say this, and I acknowledge I am not the popular parent in my house. It is my husband. I am the one of the tough love. But I do believe a little bit in tough love. At the end, we do want these countries to develop. And so.
Hélène, some comments? Final comments?
I think in terms of the priorities for fiscal surveillance, I mean, the report lays them out in a way, but I'll flag maybe a couple areas where we see particularly fruitful further investment at the IMF in that area. One is on the setting of the approach to setting medium-term anchors, whether it's debt to GDP ratios or debt paths, kind of really operationalizing that three-pronged approach with these three objectives, and finishing that by bringing that to an analytical framework and giving more guidance to mission chiefs on setting those medium-term anchors. Because I think, as what was said by Rodrigo and Laura, that's what underpins the whole fiscal advice ultimately. And then the other area where we see a lot of room to get a lot of bang for the bucks is to improve the distributional analysis. And that goes to what Laura was saying, not focusing only on the most vulnerable, as the fund has done, but looking at the entire distribution. And that will help both for the political economy aspect, the traction, but also to understand better these feedback loops, how the measures feed back to the distribution and to growth and to the collection of tax revenue. So wherever feasible, where the data exists, I think there's a lot to be gained, because fiscal policy ultimately is a political instrument for redistribution. So those two areas I would like to flag.
Rodrigo?
No, perhaps I want to go back to the leak question. That is a very difficult question, because I think we don't have a lot of successful cases that we can say, oh, this was a leak 20 years ago and now is in a path. There are a few. I think we need to discuss much more in the reviews that are forthcoming. Also to talk more to people who know more about this. And I'm not an expert of leaks at all. I just learned a bit with Haiti in my previous job. Patricia, it's sitting there. Now I'm starting to learn more. But the more I get into people who know about this, I think there's a disconnect between our discussion, that is macro, cyclical, optimalities, and the problems that they see in the ground, of capacity, of knowing where is the cycle, how to prepare to the next shock, that is a weather shock. So I don't want to give an answer. I just want to plea that I don't know too much. I have a lot to learn, but also many of us need to do that learning.
Okay, I think we are over time, so we can conclude here. Thank you again very much. A lot of food for thought. And yeah, let's see. We hope that the evaluation contributes to the CSR and to the review of conditionality and see how. Thank you very much for participating.